Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming. We're running a little late, so I want to get started. We are discussing social media policy, and we have the two gentlemen that wrote PBS's social media policy. Kevin Dando, Director of Digital Marketing Communications, and Mark Mangum, Assistant General Counsel. This is Mark here, and this is Kevin. And okay, thank you. We're fine. And I'm Mike Brower with KET in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm actually with the Production Council, and actually my boss was asking me, why is the Production Council, dealing with social media policy? And my response to that was that when the council got together, this seems to be areas that we're just not certain about. We needed more information, and this was, and so a lot of the sessions that the Production Council seem to be doing this year are around social media and what we're all running into right now. A lot of us, I think, feel like we don't have our legs under us on this issue, and hopefully this will help a little bit. And with that, I'm going to turn to these gentlemen and enjoy.
Hello, I'm Kevin Dando. I'm the Director of Digital Marketing Communications. So I'm in the Communications Department at PBS, and actually Mark and I are 2/3 of the people who worked on the PBS's social media policy. The other person is Jamie Swain, who had at that time headed up PBS Engage. And she still is at PBS Interactive now, but I just wanted to make that clear. It's important to know that because we actually, part of the reason why we think that this social media policy works is because of the teamwork that we did between Communications Department, the Legal Department, and Interactive. So we weren't working in a vacuum, and we could compare notes, and we can get kind of feedback from each other's groups about how realistic or not the social media policy was that we were putting together. A little bit of background. We actually worked on this social media policy for PBS for about a year. So part of that was, in fact, going back to the groups that we work with to make sure that everyone was comfortable with it. Mark's going to talk about the process that he went through, which was much more extensive, to kind of ascertain what other groups were doing with social media policy and seeing which ones were really kind of burdensome and hard, and which ones were progressive and more inclusive and sort of encouraged people to actually participate in social media, which was kind of the event that we wanted to go for, which was to try to get people out and using social media, but be mindful of the things that they needed to be thinking about as they were kind of going through it. So the first page is kind of a look at, this is kind of of course everyone knows this, we're in a completely different world. I oversee PBS's Facebook page and Twitter accounts. So this is the thing I'm dealing with all day long, is trying to figure out how we can engage people on social media and how we can kind of get them thinking about PBS and what's on your stations, what's coming up, how we can get them engaged in our content in different ways. So Facebook is increasingly important for us. We had a speaker from Facebook at PBS a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about how everyone knows that there are 500 million people on Facebook. That's not actually true. There are 500 million people who are active on Facebook. There are anywhere between 600 and 700 million people on Facebook. And the stat that he threw out that blew me away was that in the United States, everyone who's between 18 and 35, 2/3 of them go on Facebook every day. So it's increasingly where people are spending more and more of their time. It's outstripping even Google in terms of traffic. That happened for the first time ever in December. So it's just, Facebook is so rich for us and is so important for what we do. So many of our employees are on Facebook too, which is part of the reason why we're getting into this social media policy. You probably heard last week that Facebook was given a valuation of $50 billion by Goldman Sachs, although it probably won't be going in public anytime soon. It's got this insane valuation, which also speaks to its power. Twitter, and I should back up and say that we have about 500,000 fans on the PBS Facebook page. Twitter, we have about 680,000 followers, and that's a much different aspect for us. We find that we get a lot more people on Twitter who are engaged in conversation, and we can engage them in different ways that way. Facebook, we see, drives lots of traffic. So that's been important to us for that way. Twitter has been really good for just straight up engagement. And there are 120 million accounts on Twitter right now. with about 30 to 40 billion of those being active, which gives you some scale as compared to Facebook. LinkedIn is another way. I want to ask how many of you are on Facebook? I assume everyone is, and most of you are on Twitter, but how many of you are on LinkedIn? Basically everyone. And there are 90 million active users of LinkedIn. And Mark's actually going to talk about kind of a recent wrinkle with LinkedIn that's very interesting in how it impacts social media and things that you may or may not want to consider doing with regard to using LinkedIn. Something that's kind of interesting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. He's going to talk about some of the specific things that we went through, the bullet points. And actually, I forgot. What I'll do is when Mark's talking, I brought hard copies of the actual social media policy so you can have it. And I think I have enough copies for everyone here. And then and our contact information is at the end. If there aren't enough, or if you want me to email you an electronic copy, you can just send it to me and I'll email it. But in the meantime, I'm going to start passing it out right now.
So for those of you who just came in, my name is Mark Mangum. I'm Assistant General Counsel at PBS. And I get involved, and I'll try and not, I have a tendency to wander around as I'm talking, so I'll try, Bob, to stay close to here for you. But I got involved with this essentially the first day I started at PBS. And like as Kevin was saying, it took us about a year to go through the process of making sure that we were balancing all the right things, and that we felt comfortable that our policy was something that we could stand behind, that knowing, as all things in social media get put out on the internet immediately, knowing that our policy would be out there really quickly, we just felt it just took us a while to make sure that we were comfortable with all this. I gave a couple presentations last year about social media and the law. I don't know if any of you, there were some webinars that our interactive team put together. And in those sessions, a lot of people asked, when can we see the PBS social media policy? Can we borrow it? Can we use it in any way? So we are very comfortable if people want to use our policy, if you want to modify it, if you want to change it for your own needs, that's great. It's at this point, it's a resource for all of you to use. And what I wanted to do first is go through some of the key points that we were trying to make. And in particular, as we started looking at social media policies that are out there, there were some that were very heavily criticized for their draconian nature, or for other issues that they had with them. At PBS, we had spent about a year in our interactive team strongly encouraging all of our people to be out there on Facebook, to be out there on Twitter, promoting programs and engaging with the audience. And we didn't want to take away from that. We still strongly believe that the engagement with the audience that is available through social media is extremely valuable. So we want to continue, and as we, when we launch tentpole programs, there's always some sort of message that either comes from Kevin or someone else in communications, encouraging PBS employees to promote the show on Facebook or tweet about it, or if they have a blog, perhaps talk about it a little bit. And our policy is really set up in a way to balance the great benefits that we can get from engaging in social media with some of the risks that are involved. And so I got involved mostly because of the legal risks that are still somewhat undefined, as the law usually takes a little while to catch up to what's happening in technology. But there are also other risks that I'll talk about a little bit from a PR perspective, from an HR perspective. Those are kind of the other main risks. So let me go through some of the key points that we tried to make in putting together our policy. The first thing, and the thing that when you look, and I'll talk about some examples of people who have had issues or created problems for themselves or their companies when they've done things on social media. But if people can remember these key points, you will generally be okay in what you're doing in social media. I think if you stay within these, kind of fence posts, as we put it in some places, you should be okay in terms of mitigating the risks. The first one is that you are responsible for what you post online. The individual who posts something needs to remember that and keep that in mind. Even this morning, I was watching on ESPN. LeBron James tweeted something yesterday that he probably shouldn't have. And it was interesting to hear him say, "Oh, that wasn't even for me, it was a friend of mine, and I just kind of posted it." Well, no, it came from his Twitter account. He's responsible for it. And so he's, has to deal with the media and the fans and potentially some other players based on the thing that he tweeted. You just need to remember, and people need to remember, that they're responsible for all the content that they post. And in conjunction with that is whatever you post stays online forever. Okay, the lifespan of something online is infinite. And even if you delete it, it can be found. Right? I'm pretty involved with social media. I'm not a huge tech guru, but I do know that there are websites that archive the internet. So if somebody posts something and it's inflammatory or problematic, and other people want to find it, they can probably find it. So just, this is something that we stress, especially when Kevin and I were doing these sessions at PBS. We especially were focusing some of these messages on some of the younger employees who maybe this was their first job out of college, and they had a certain way of interacting with their friends and colleagues online when they were in college. But when you come into the professional world, some of those, they brought some of those habits, but had forgotten some of these points. So we really, this was something, and I think if Jamie were here, I know that this was something that she definitely wanted to convey to some of the younger employees at PBS. And this kind of goes in conjunction with it. If you wouldn't put it on a billboard, don't post it online. And Kevin also used the example, if you wouldn't want it to be a headline on the front page of the Washington Post, don't put it online, right? And it just, again, it just goes back to things that are out there online, can be seen by a lot of people. I've heard and know of instances where people have posted something on Facebook and they thought, oh, that's only going to go to my 200 friends. Well, maybe one of those friends isn't such a friend, and they're going to repost it somewhere else and connect you to it. That if you put something out there online, it can be seen all over the place. And then this is where we get into a little bit, and we took some of these slides straight from our presentation, so it's talking about PBS. But as you're creating your own social media policy, this obviously you can tailor this for your own organization. But we were trying to convey to people that they need to be aware of their association online with PBS. And part of that comes from, I'll talk in a few minutes about the potential liability that employers could have for things that their employees are doing. And I'll give you a good example, actually. When I started PBS about 1.5 years ago, and before I was at PBS, I was an independent producer. And so I had a Twitter account that was promoting one of our productions. So essentially that's why I created it. I didn't tell anybody at PBS or in public media about that account, except in one of the sessions that I did about 1 year ago, I happened to mention that. And within a day, I was listed on about 10 Twitter lists for people who work in public media or at PBS. And I had, I gained maybe 20 or 30 followers out of that. And nothing on Twitter connects me to PBS. But because of my job, because of the things that I do, people did make that connection. And that's something that's probably true of all of us. That's probably true of anybody who works at any of our organizations. So we just wanted to remind people, be aware of how you and the things that you're doing connect you back to your organization, connect you back to PBS in our instance. And then you need to keep in mind the actions, the impact of the things that you say, and what they could have on your organization, on PBS for us, right? That, if I'm out there saying negative things about whatever it might be, related to public media, that could have an impact back on PBS. If I were out there trying to give legal advice in this area through my Facebook or Twitter account, that might not be a great idea either, because of the impact that it could have back on our organization. So, again, it's just people need to kind of make those connections and remember, oh yeah, people can tie these things back in. They can connect you back to what your job might be. This point about always identifying yourself when you're discussing PBS was really more directed at people who have individual and personal blogs. And so when we were looking at social media policies, we included all the things that Kevin mentioned, and he had, I think, Blogger as one of the symbols on there. And we obviously have quite a few people at PBS who have their own personal blogs. Some of them are related to media and some are not. To the extent that people are discussing things related to PBS in their blogs, they should point out that they're identified with that.
And also in comments.
And also in comments, that's true, that's a good point, right? For example, if there's an article about, this is the example we used in our sessions, if there's an article about PBS in the LA Times, and you go in there to make a comment about the nature of that article, you probably should be identifying yourself as being associated with PBS.